Al-Anfal Campaign. The Al-Anfal Campaign was a systematic effort by the Iraqi government under the leadership of Saddam Hussein to suppress and eliminate the Kurdish population in northern Iraq during the late 1980s. The campaign, named after a chapter in the Quran, was carried out by the Iraqi military under the direction of Ali Hassan al-Majid, who became known as Chemical Ali for his use of chemical weapons. The campaign began in 1986 and reached its peak in 1988 when Iraqi forces launched a series of attacks on Kurdish villages. The most infamous of these attacks occurred in the town of Halabja in March 1988, where Iraqi planes dropped chemical weapons, killing an estimated 5,000 people and injuring thousands more. The use of chemical weapons was part of a broader strategy that included mass executions, the destruction of thousands of villages, and the displacement of up to 1.5 million Kurds. The Al-Anfal campaign was not limited to military assaults. It was a full-scale operation to eliminate Kurdish resistance and weaken the Kurdish identity. Tens of thousands of Kurds were killed, and many more were subjected to torture, imprisonment, and forced relocation. The Iraqi government justified the campaign as a counterinsurgency effort against Kurdish rebels, but its scale and brutality left no doubt that it was an attempt to destroy the Kurdish population. The campaign ended in 1989, but its effects have lingered for decades. The Kurds continue to remember Al-Anfal as a defining moment in their history, and the atrocities committed during the campaign were later recognized as acts of genocide by the Iraqi High Tribunal after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. The Holocaust. During World War II, a terrifying regime led by Adolf Hitler sought to systematically exterminate millions of people, especially targeting Jewish communities. This became known as the Holocaust, a name synonymous with immense suffering and loss. What began with discrimination and marginalization soon escalated into mass murder, driven by the Nazis' racial ideology. The Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It started with anti-Semitic laws, such as the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, which stripped Jews of their rights. As the Nazis gained more power, they set up ghettos where Jews were forced to live in squalid conditions. Then, in 1941, the final solution was put into motion. This plan aimed to annihilate Europe's Jewish population. Jews, along with other groups like Romani people, disabled individuals, and political dissidents, were sent to concentration and extermination camps, the most infamous being Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Trains packed with people were sent to these camps, where many faced immediate death in gas chambers. Others endured slave labor, starvation, and horrific medical experiments. The Nazis murdered approximately 6 million Jews during this period, along with millions of others, including Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, they uncovered the full extent of the atrocities. The images and testimonies from survivors shocked the world, leading to post-war trials, such as the Nuremberg trials, where key Nazi leaders were held accountable. The Holocaust left an indelible scar on human history, serving as a reminder of the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and unchecked power. Armenian genocide. In the shadows of World War I, a horrific event unfolded in the Ottoman Empire that many still struggle to acknowledge today. In 1915, the Ottoman government launched a campaign to eliminate the Armenian population, marking the beginning of the Armenian genocide. Over the course of 8 years, between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed through massacres, forced marches, and starvation. Armenians had lived within the Ottoman Empire for centuries but were increasingly seen as a threat by the ruling Young Turks, who believed they were sympathetic to the empire's enemies, particularly Russia. On April 24, 1915, Armenian intellectuals and community leaders were arrested in Constantinople, now Istanbul, signaling the start of a wider campaign of extermination. Armenian men were either executed or sent to labor camps, while women, children, and the elderly were forced to march through the Syrian desert without food or water. Those who survived the death marches were often sent to concentration camps, where conditions were unbearable. Many were subject to torture, rape, and other unspeakable atrocities. By the time the genocide ended in 1923, Most of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire had been wiped out. To this day, the Armenian genocide remains a contentious issue, particularly with Turkey, the Ottoman Empire's successor state, refusing to recognize the event as genocide. However, the evidence is overwhelming, and many countries and historians have acknowledged it as one of the first modern genocides. The memory of this tragedy continues to shape Armenian identity and history. Bengali genocide. In 1971, one of the most brutal episodes in South Asian history unfolded as the Pakistani military launched a violent crackdown in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. The roots of the conflict lay in the political and economic disparities between East and West Pakistan, with the former feeling marginalized. When the Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won the majority in the 1970 elections and pushed for autonomy, tensions boiled over. On March 25, 1971, the Pakistani military initiated Operation Searchlight, aiming to suppress the burgeoning independence movement. What followed was widespread violence against the Bengali population, especially targeting intellectuals, students, and Hindus. The military used heavy artillery to bombard major cities like Dhaka, and systematic massacres occurred across the region. An estimated 300,000 to 3 million people were killed during the conflict, while over 10 million fled to neighboring India, leading to a massive refugee crisis. Alongside the killings, there were reports of mass rape, with between 200,000 to 400,000 women subjected to sexual violence. These atrocities were part of a deliberate effort to break the spirit of the Bengali people. Despite the scale of the violence, the global response was slow, though international pressure eventually mounted. By December 1971, India intervened militarily in support of the Bengali independence movement. After a short but intense war, Bangladesh gained its independence on December 16, 1971. Bosnian genocide. The Bosnian genocide occurred during the breakup of Yugoslavia, a time marked by intense ethnic violence. As the region descended into civil war, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence in 1992. This set the stage for one of the most brutal episodes in European history since World War II, with Bosnian Serb forces carrying out campaigns of ethnic cleansing against Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims. The most infamous atrocity took place in Srebrenica, a town that had been declared a safe zone by the United Nations. Thousands of Bosniak civilians sought refuge there, believing they would be protected by UN peacekeepers. However, in July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces, led by General Ratko Mladic, captured the town. What followed was horrifying. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically executed over just a few days, while women and children were forcibly expelled. This massacre was part of a broader pattern of violence during the Bosnian War, where entire towns were wiped out and concentration camps were set up for ethnic cleansing. The term ethnic cleansing was widely used to describe the deliberate efforts by Bosnian Serbs to remove Bosniaks and Croats from territories they wished to control. The war ended in 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Agreement, which brought peace to the region. However, the legacy of the genocide lingers as survivors continue to seek justice. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia convicted many high-ranking officials of war crimes, including Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic. The genocide left a profound scar on Bosnia and the wider world, serving as a stark reminder of the horrors that can arise from ethnic hatred and political ambition. Cambodian genocide. When the Khmer Rouge came to power in Cambodia in 1975, the country was plunged into one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. Led by Pol Pot, the regime sought to create a utopian society based on extreme communist ideals. Their vision involved emptying cities and forcing people to work on collective farms in the countryside. This radical social engineering experiment resulted in the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2.2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the population. Immediately after taking control, the Khmer Rouge ordered the evacuation of cities, including the capital, Phnom Penh. People were forced to abandon their homes and walk for days into rural labor camps, where they were made to work long hours in the fields with little food. Those who resisted or were suspected of opposing the regime were executed on the spot. Pol Pot's regime targeted anyone who was seen as a threat to their vision. Intellectuals, professionals, ethnic minorities, and even those who wore glasses were marked for death. The infamous Tuol Sleng prison, also known as S-21, became a symbol of the terror, where thousands were tortured and later executed. The genocide finally came to an end when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979 and toppled the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot and other leaders fled into the jungle, and the country began the long process of recovery. The Cambodian genocide remains one of the most devastating episodes of mass killing, and trials against Khmer Rouge leaders have only recently concluded, giving some measure of justice to the survivors. Darfur Genocide. The Darfur Genocide is a tragic conflict that erupted in the Darfur region of Western Sudan in 2003. What began as a local rebellion quickly escalated into a full-blown humanitarian crisis, with the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed militia committing mass atrocities against the local population. The conflict started when two rebel groups, the Sudan Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement, took up arms against the Sudanese government, accusing it of marginalizing Darfur's non-Arab population. In response, the government launched a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, enlisting the help of the Janjaweed, an Arab militia, to carry out attacks on villages suspected of supporting the rebels. The result was widespread violence, with entire villages burned to the ground, women and children raped, and civilians massacred. Over 300,000 people are believed to have been killed, and more than 2.5 million were displaced from their homes. The tactics used by the Janjaweed and government forces were particularly brutal, with reports of mass killings, torture, and destruction of entire communities. The international community responded with outrage, but little action was taken to stop the violence. The United Nations and African Union eventually deployed a peacekeeping force, but the conflict continued to smolder with intermittent flare-ups of violence. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, accusing him of war crimes and genocide, but he remained in power until his ousting in 2019. Though the intensity of the violence has lessened in recent years, the conflict in Darfur remains unresolved. The region is still struggling with displacement, insecurity, and a lack of basic services. The Darfur genocide is a stark reminder of how ethnic and political tensions, if left unchecked, can spiral into devastating violence. Guatemalan genocide. The Guatemalan genocide is one of the darkest periods in Central American history, occurring during the country's 36-year civil war, 1960 to 1996. Between 1981 and 1983, under the leadership of military dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, the Guatemalan government waged a brutal campaign against the country's indigenous Maya population, particularly in rural areas. The conflict began as a fight between leftist guerrillas and the government, but it quickly turned into a campaign of mass violence against the Maya people, who were suspected of supporting the rebels. The Guatemalan military, along with paramilitary groups, carried out scorched earth tactics, burning villages, massacring civilians, and forcibly displacing entire communities. Women and children were not spared, with reports of widespread sexual violence and torture. An estimated 200,000 people were killed during the Civil War, with around 83% of the victims being indigenous Maya. The genocide reached its peak during Ríos Montt's rule, when more than 600 villages were destroyed and thousands of people were either killed or disappeared. Despite overwhelming evidence of the atrocities, justice was slow to come. It wasn't until 2013 that Ríos Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, making him the first former head of state to be convicted of genocide in his own country. However, the conviction was later overturned on a technicality, and Ríos Montt died in 2018 without facing final justice. Holodomor. In the early 1930s, Ukraine, once known as the breadbasket of Europe, became the scene of a devastating famine that killed millions of people. The Holodomor, a term meaning death by hunger in Ukrainian, was not caused by natural disaster, but by the brutal policies of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. At the time, Stalin was pushing for rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. This meant that individual farms were seized by the state and turned into large collective farms. The government set impossibly high grain quotas, which left Ukrainian farmers with nothing to eat. Despite the worsening famine, the Soviet Union continued to export grain abroad to fund industrial projects. The situation grew even worse as Stalin viewed Ukrainian nationalism as a threat to his control. Borders were sealed, preventing Ukrainians from fleeing or seeking help. Even though reports of the famine reached the West, Soviet propaganda denied its existence, and any attempt to provide aid was blocked. It's estimated that between 3 and 7 million people died from starvation, though some scholars argue the number could be higher. The famine left a lasting scar on Ukraine's collective memory. While the Soviet Union long denied its role in the tragedy, Ukraine declared it an act of genocide after gaining independence in 1991. Today, many countries recognize the Holodomor as one of the most horrific examples of man-made famine, Indonesian genocide. In 1965, Indonesia was plunged into a horrific period of violence following an alleged coup attempt against President Sukarno. This event, known as the September 30th movement, became the catalyst for widespread massacres across the country, particularly targeting members of the Communist Party of Indonesia, PKI, as well as ethnic Chinese Indonesians and leftist sympathizers. The military, under General Suharto, used the coup attempt as a pretext to launch a bloody campaign to eradicate communism from Indonesia. In a matter of months, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people were killed. Civilians were often encouraged to take part in the killings, leading to mobs hunting down suspected communists, with bodies thrown into rivers or mass graves. The military-backed violence was brutal, with many victims subjected to torture before being executed. Beyond the political violence, ethnic Chinese communities were also targeted due to their perceived association with communism, resulting in widespread looting and killings. This period of chaos cemented Suharto's rise to power, and by 1967, he had replaced Sukarno as Indonesia's president. The Indonesian genocide remained shrouded in silence for decades, as the Suharto regime controlled the narrative, portraying the mass killings as a necessary measure to save the nation from communism. It wasn't until Suharto's fall from power in 1998 that discussions about the genocide began to emerge more openly. However, even today, the events remain highly sensitive, with many survivors and families of victims still waiting for recognition and justice. Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide stands as one of the most brutal and fast-moving genocides in modern history. In just 100 days between April and July 1994, an estimated 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutus were brutally killed by Hutu extremists. This devastating event was fueled by long-standing ethnic tensions between the Hutu majority and the Tutsi minority. The spark came on April 6, 1994, when the plane-carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, was shot down. While the identity of those responsible is still debated, Hutu extremists used this event as a pretext to launch a mass-killing spree. What followed was a coordinated campaign to wipe out the Tutsi population. Hutu militias, with the support of government forces, went from village to village killing men, women, and children. Neighbors turned on each other, often armed with nothing more than machetes or clubs. What made this genocide even more tragic was the international community's failure to act. United Nations peacekeepers were present in Rwanda but were powerless to intervene due to limitations in their mandate. Despite clear signs of the mass killing, global leaders hesitated, and by the time the world took notice, the genocide had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The violence only stopped when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a Tutsi-led rebel group, captured the capital, Kigali, and overthrew the Hutu government. In the years that followed, Rwanda sought to rebuild itself, with justice pursued through both international and local courts. However, the memories of 1994 remain raw, as survivors continue to mourn the loss of their families and communities.